Right. Afternoon once again. Welcome to Introduction to Cyber Security. Now you'll discover that I think it's like we said before. It's really difficult to discuss anything ICT without delving into what security is all about, why it's important, and obviously what it does for us as far as basic configuration infrastructure and generic setup there is concerned. So this particular module is going to expand on obviously the security part that we discussed in computer architecture, and also a touch on content that is associated with network architecture as well. I think, like I said in the previous session, that you'll discover that these three modules are literally naturally interrelated. There's going to be a lot of content that literally overlaps. Why? Because you'll discover that as far as configuration is concerned, as far as the whole concept of troubleshooting is concerned, understanding exactly how an operating system functions, understanding exactly how a network in its entirety is configured rather and functions, and also understanding exactly what security is all about and why it's relevant and necessary is literally incorporated across all three modules as far as content would go. So in today's session, looking at the first chapter per se, or first section or introductory part associated with the actual module content, and also understanding certain terms that are relevant, and also looking at exactly why this particular concept of security is ultimately important and what it does for us as far as configurations would go. So as with the previous module, just looking at the prescribed textbook, also understanding what's happening as far as the actual module overview is concerned, the different learning units that are there. It's going to be 5 in total for this particular module, and also looking at the assessment platforms that are associated with the module at large. So the first thing that you obviously want to distinctively look at is the prescribed textbook, which is labeled on screen currently. So David Sutton, 2017 edition rather, Cybersecurity Practitioner's Guide. You also have the EBSCO link there. So if you look at your student guide or your learn guide, you've got that particular link incorporated. If you haven't gotten the textbook yet, you've got an online version of it that you can literally access using that distinctive link there. I think it's only applicable when you are online. If I'm not mistaken, it's not a downloadable version, but anyone can correct me there if I'm off the ball. So that's the prescribed textbook. And just to make sure that you've got the right one, this is what the actual cover looks like. So David Sutton again, Cybersecurity is a Practitioner's Guide, a bit tongue-tied there. And like I said before, I think it's about 11 chapters that we're going to be looking at, if I'm not mistaken, that are relevant. But obviously, the actual learning units at large is 5 of them. So you'll discover that 1 or 2 or more learning units will obviously have bits and pieces from several chapters as far as the actual content at large there is concerned. Now, when it comes to the actual purpose, like we said before, just understanding what security is all about, what needs to be incorporated in terms of securing environments. Obviously, understanding the threats first, because it's very difficult, again, to discuss the whole concept of security if you don't understand what the threat is or what the actual issues are at large. So it's important to identify what possible threats would be, what are these threats, what is a typical example of a threat, and how you would distinctively try and safeguard environments accordingly as far as your specific setup would go. So you've got about 4 module outcomes. And again, like we were mentioning a couple of seconds ago, what is the importance of securing content, looking at obviously the ethics behind the whole concept of threats, attacks, rather, vulnerabilities, as well as distinctive infringements that are incorporated currently, and understanding how to circumvent them accordingly as far as your specific environments would go. So that's the module purpose at large. Like I said before, it's rather important for you to be familiar with some of these concepts, if not all of them, to ensure that when you look at your own environment from a professional point of view, especially even from a personal environment, just to understand exactly how you can properly secure or safeguard both your content and hardware at large from inadvertent threats or even deliberate threats, if you look at it from a different point of view. Now, when you look at it from assessments, again, content that you're already familiar with, I think we're not going to spend too much time in terms of what's happening with ICE there. We're all familiar in that regard. Again, like I've said before, please take cognizance of the research or the tasks that I do give you, because each one of them is distinctively relevant. And then with your test, you've got a 25% allocation, learning units 1 to 3 associated in that regard. It's a 1 hour paper naturally. Then you've got an assignment, 30%, 100 marks, and naturally pass marks for all those assessments is naturally going to be 50%. And I think we've already discussed the whole concept of what's happening with your supplementaries, 40, 48. And then if you're outside the confines of, obviously, if you're below that distinctive range, unfortunately, you need to repeat the module. So it's a POE-based module as well. So I think it's important for us to take cognizance of the task at hand. And again, like we said before, diarize the actual due dates for certain sections there, just to make sure that we all on the same page, just to avoid any discrepancies that might arise. Should there be any presentations that are necessary, you'll still need to take heed. I think same difference with what we've experienced with the previous module. I think help desk, was it? In terms of the need for these presentations at large, whichever dates I set, unfortunately set in stone. So ensure that we are all on the same page there to avoid any inadvertent misunderstandings in that regard. So that's 120 marks incorporated there. They've mentioned the duration there. I think I'm assuming that's a bit of a typo. Or alternatively, what it would mean is this particular assessment would actually change to an exam or be an exam. So just keep your ears on the ground in that regard. So it's listed as a POE in your student manual. They've mentioned the marks and the actual hours per se there. But I'm assuming that that could be a typo in terms of the actual duration there. But if it's not, then it literally might mean that this would possibly be an exam. So whichever way works, if you want to look at it in all honesty, whether it's a POE or an exam, you still should be good to go as far as content would go there. So that's your assessment at large. Should there be any changes, I'm sure the campus would give you a heads up in that regard. I'll also be giving you some kind of clarity in terms of, is it actually going to be a portfolio of evidence at the end of the day, or it's an actual exam that you're going to be writing as far as this particular module would go. So you've got learning units that are typically incorporated. We said 5 of them. So you've got the introductory part, which we're obviously going to be looking at in today's session. Again, basic fundamentals. Like I said before, most of these introductory sessions would literally revisit some of the content that you are all familiar with, especially when you're looking at it from computer architecture perspectives. And then obviously, as we go a bit deeper into module content, you find that acumen becomes a bit different or a bit more specific. in line with what the module is offering. But again, just understanding what's happening there, introducing some of the terms that are relevant in that regard, revisiting some of the terms that you obviously already know as far as your content would go. And then with learning unit number 2, just understanding what the threats are, what are the actual impacts associated with some of these security breaches that can exist, what are the actual reasons for certain cyber attacks in certain instances. Also understanding concepts associated with what they call the terms associated with hacking, what is ethical, what is unethical, and in which environments these particular configurations used as far as your particular setup would go. And then management of the security. Remember, we've mentioned fault tolerance before, RAID being a typical example, but you also have disaster recovery, which is also imperative to understand how that functions accordingly with the appropriate backups, with restoration of systems and configurations, with looking at business continuity to ensure that you have the least amount of downtime should you literally have been affected by a specific attack as far as your setup would go. I think it's important also to familiarize ourselves with not just what has happened in the past in terms of these security breaches and so on, but also looking at what has happened currently as far as our specific environments would go. I think if you look at just this year alone, if I'm not mistaken, there was a meat factory or a food chain in the US that was cyber attacked a couple of months ago, if I'm not mistaken. And then just recently in our own space, I think Transnet also experienced a bit of a security breach that was arguably problematic. And I think even from the presidential environment as well, you had news in the media recently as well in terms of certain breaches as well within personal and professional capacities in that space. So it's also important to identify what is happening in that regard, and obviously what could have been done to try and circumvent these issues, or what can be done to try and circumvent these issues if you want to look at it from a different perspective. And then also looking at basic plans put in place. I think this also overlaps from what I was just mentioning a couple of seconds ago in terms of what policies can be put in place to safely safeguard or to look at safeguarding of data, safeguarding of environments, if you want to look at it from a different perspective. So it's important to understand that certain policies are imperative to successful security. I think one of the things as well that is relevant in this regard is to identify and understand that no systems can literally be 100% secure, but you can make it more difficult for anyone who tries to access in an unauthorized fashion to get content or to get within that locality or environment. So it's important to ensure that you understand that fact that you can only do so much, but it's always imperative for you to be ultimately prepared to avoid any problematic issues that obviously can arise if you haven't put in place the right policies or procedures to try and safeguard your environments. And then the last one is just understanding what's happening with the different types of standards and guidelines that are there from an organizational point of view that literally can be incorporated. So these are just some of the basic principles and practices that are literally used, not just obviously from an enterprise perspective, but obviously within your own personal environments as well, just to try and safeguard against your unauthorized access. I think more often than not, some of the things that we take for granted in terms of ensuring that our content or our environments or our infrastructures are safeguarded accordingly. So it's important to ensure that you spend enough resources, especially economically, in terms of trying to make sure that your environments are ultimately secure, especially when you look at it from a corporate perspective, just to avoid discrepancies. So the author, as a distinctive quote from another cybersecurity professional, Robert Clark, that mentioned that, and obviously if you're spending more on coffee than IT security, you will be hacked, all right? And he goes on to say, what's more is that you deserve to be hacked if you're not obviously taking appropriate consideration of your security environment as far as your particular setup there is concerned. So I think what you will discover is, as you delve into content associated with the module, is just to understand why it's very important to spend enough time as well as resources to ensure that environments are ultimately secure, just to avoid any discrepancies at large there. So you find that cybersecurity or information security, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, it's literally an element of IT that virtually was unheard of a couple of years ago. But the main concept is focusing on protecting valuable electronic information of organizations and users, right? So that's the main focus of what cybersecurity is all about, but more on the information security platform, where you're focusing on protecting valuable electronic information of organizations and users. And remember, security at large can be considered as a state of freedom from any particular danger or risk. So it's important to obviously understand what the dangers are. It's also important for you to understand what the risks might be in terms of content. And I think what this also does for us is, if you look at the whole concept of data, information, and the relationship associated with these particular entities, it's imperative to understand that when you're looking at it from a basic perspective, remember, data is just generically raw facts and figures. So if you want to look at it from a different point of view, data, let's see the thickness here. Right. So data is ultimately just the whole concept of basic raw facts and figures. So data, raw facts and figures, data is processed, you get a meaningful substance, which is information. And then once you use that information, or when you use that information, you become knowledgeable. So you get knowledge there, and then when you use that knowledge, obviously you can distinctively make appropriate decisions. You're now slightly wiser, if you want to look at it from a different point of view. So as you go across from data to information to knowledge to decisions, or to distinctive wisdom, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, there's value that is being added across the platform. So if you're looking at it from this particular perspective, we've got a certain semblance of value added as far as these particular entity platforms they are concerned, right? But obviously, if the reverse, if you're looking at it from the reverse, from your decision to your knowledge to your information to your data, the moment you go in a different direction, you're actually looking at volume, right? So normally you find that when you're looking at the entities that I've got on screen there, they form part and parcel of what they call the knowledge hierarchy, where you're now looking at data. Just because it's raw facts and figures, it's normally associated with much larger volumes. Same difference would go with information, but obviously the moment you go the other way, literally what you are distinctively looking at there is that you've got some semblance of value incorporated there, because data, raw facts and figures, the moment it's processed, it becomes a meaningful substance information. That information can distinctively be used to gain knowledge in terms of a specific subject or entity. That knowledge will then enable you to make inferences, deductions, and recommendations, which are generic decisions associated with your particular setup. And obviously, the reason why this is important is because we've mentioned this before, that you'll normally discover that a lot of individuals forget to understand that the most important aspect of any ICT environment is obviously the data. I think we mentioned this before, that when you look at physical entities, when you look at hardware at large, when you look at some of the softwares, should these particular entities get damaged, lost, stolen, corrupted, you name it, they can be replaced, regardless of how pricey they might be. But obviously, the data that, or the information, well, literally the data that you've got incorporated or stored, if it's lost and if there's no backup, it obviously means that you've lost quite a valuable entity. And more often than not, this is what we're trying to protect in any given instance, as far as our ICT infrastructures are concerned. So the priceless component, or the most valuable, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, is arguably the data. So it's very important to understand what the knowledge hierarchy is all about, and obviously what it does in terms of enabling us to understand why security becomes ultimately important in that regard when it comes to configurations at large. So if you look at, let's see if we can quickly plug in an actual relationship that you take into consideration here. So you've got the knowledge hierarchy as well as the pyramid that enables you to understand exactly what's happening, especially from a security point of view. So we've got something along the lines of what you've got on screen there. So this is a typical example of knowledge management cognitive pyramid. Like I've mentioned before, where you've got your data right at the beginning there. It's knowing what you. It's all about what you have, or what that particular substance is all about. And then with knowledge, you're knowing you're knowing how to do something. And obviously with the whole concept of wisdom and the decisions we mentioned early on, knowing why that needs to be done. And as you can see, if you look at the whole concept of configuration that is there, the decision risk is obviously a lot higher when you're looking at just data on its own. Why? Because data on its own is just basic raw facts and figures. So you can't make it's just based on raw facts and figures, right? Those raw facts and figures have to be processed into a meaningful substance first, which is your information. That information now then has to be used to gain knowledge, and then obviously to become wise within your specific setup. That's the reason why you find that when you're looking at your data, that data, you've got processing, you've got the cognition associated with information, and then the ultimate judgment incorporated in that specific setup there. So with your information management, as you can see, you've got collection, processing, dissemination, storage, display, and protection of that particular information or data in that regard. But then once that has been gotten, you're now looking at focusing on knowledge management, which is looking at creation, organization, application, and transference of what you've got incorporated there. So the moment you get something meaningful, as you can see, the decision risk, as we go up, your risk becomes a lot diminished if you're looking at it from a different point of view. But the moment you come down, it becomes a lot higher. Why? Because you can't make informed decisions, like I was mentioning earlier on. If you're not knowledgeable, if you haven't literally looked at understanding the information that has been incorporated, or if the data that you've initially have has not been distinctively processed accordingly. And then again, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, the same aspect, but obviously from a different perspective, in order for you to look at some added understanding, again, if you look at what we've got on screen currently, we've got that data, which is the context information, confers to meaning, that knowledge enables you to gain insight. And again, the decision risk is still one and the same. You've got your individual facts, figures, signals, basic measurements. And then obviously when you're looking at information, that process platform, you now have organized, structured, categorized, and useful, condensed or calculated substances there. With knowledge, you've got an idea. You're now learning. There's a notion, there's a concept, something that is well thought out. And then with your basic wisdom there, you now look at the basic decision-making process. So I think what is important is this particular part here, because remember, you can never make an informed decision without something meaningful in that regard. So if you then look at it from the initial point that we were mentioning early on, if you're then going to put what we've got in this particular slide in that distinctive pyramid, in order for you to understand, it's again one and distinctively the same concept. What you're now incorporating there is that you've got your decisions here. You've got your knowledge. You've got your information here. And then you've got the actual data that we were discussing earlier on. So obviously, from a hierarchy point of view, let's see if we can get this right, something along these lines. You've got that incorporated. And as we mentioned earlier on, the moment you go up that particular hierarchy or up that particular pyramid, there's value associated with your particular setup. And obviously, the moment you go down, you've got volume associated in this regard, all right? As far as configurations there would go. So what are the typical examples of where this particular data can be sourced, right? So the generic sources of data would include, so sources of data. This can include all data records as typical examples. You can also may not be as accurate, but it's still applicable as far as collection of appropriate data is concerned. You can discuss your global positioning systems, your GPS, as typical examples. Another type of environment where you can get is Bluetooth and Wi-Fi IDs or SSID. So identification and debit card transactions. So these are all examples of where you can find basic sources of data, not the only ones that are out there, but obviously some of the most common ones that you'll distinctively find as far as your setup would go. So we were mentioning the fact that with information security, it's again frequently used to describe the tasks of information in its digital format. All right. So in essence, you've got protective measures that need to be properly implemented. This is how you'd obviously have an appropriately secure environment. And ultimately, you can also even discuss protecting information that is valuable to people and organizations. We've already mentioned this. So you've got three characteristics that must be protected. All right. So if you want to look at it from a different point of view, right? We've just mentioned that with information security, you're looking at protective measures that need to be properly implemented. So if you want to look at, let's mention information security here, security. All right. If you want to look at what is happening in this regard, you're looking at if you want it to succeed, or if you want to have it in a successful setup, with information security, you're literally looking at protective measures that need to be properly implemented. So protective measures properly implemented, right? And then the second thing that you also want to ensure, like we mentioned before, obviously protection or protect information that is valuable to both people and organizations, right? But what is it that you're actually protecting? So if you look at the second one, protect information that is valuable to people and organizations, right? What is it that you're actually protecting? So you've got three characteristics that must be protected, right? And what are these three characteristics? So in essence, here we've got distinctively three characteristics that must be protected, right? What are these three characteristics, all right? In essence, what you're looking at is the first thing is confidentiality. Right? What does this actually mean? Right? So confidentiality is literally just concerned with ensuring that information is neither disclosed or nor available to those who are not authorized to have access to it. All right. So literally that your information is confidential means that anyone who's not allowed or distinctively permitted to access it does not access that distinctive content, right? And then the second thing that you want to discuss in this regard is integrity, right? What is happening in this regard? This ensures that the information is correct and no unauthorized persons or malicious software has altered that data, right, or information. Right, so this is what the whole concept of integrity is all about. Just ensuring that the data, the information that has been collected, is ultimately correct and has not been unadulterated, as far as or literally has not been corrupted, as far as a specific individual probably having gained access when they're not supposed to, or even someone who's obviously allowed to gain access, tampering with that information or tampering with that data, or that malicious software has not literally altered this particular information or data. And then the third thing that you want to look at is what they call availability, right? And obviously what this means is just that the data is accessible to the authorized user. So whenever you need, if you're an authorized user, if you're permitted, whenever you need that data, it's accessible to you as far as configurations would go. So this is what they call the security triad, all right? So another term for this is security triad. So this is what they call the CIA, all right? So your confidentiality, integrity, and availability as far as your configurations would go. But you will also discover that when it comes to if you want to look at it from probably diagrammatic configurations, there you've got your confidentiality there, and then obviously in between here we can discuss our information, or we can put our info, and then you've got your integrity part, and then naturally you've got availability. So there's a link as far as these particular entities they are concerned, and ultimately as far as your specific setup, you've got if you're going to put this in diagrammatic format, I think maybe let's see if we can resize, but anyway, that's fine. I think we can still have a different so here you've got your hardware, here you've got your software, and on top here you've got your communication. Let me just call this comms. So that's the particular structure that you've got. as far as your configurations would go. And then obviously what this also introduces is the products, which is physical security. All right, as the much a larger picture there. So this is all part and parcel of your information security components. The products itself would be the physical security around the actual data itself. So this can actually be as basic as an actual door lock, or as complicated as an intrusion detection system, whichever way you want to look at it. And then you can also discuss the people. These are the individuals that implement and obviously properly use security products to protect the data. And then you've got the procedures, which are the plans. So if you want to look at it from a different point of view, you can also discuss what we've just seen in the previous slide there as part and parcel of your information security components. And in addition, so info security components. All right. You obviously have the products, like we mentioned before. And in essence, the products are all to do with the physical security around the data, right? Physical security around the data. That's what your products are all about. So secondly, you can also even discuss, like we've mentioned before, the actual people and what's happening with the people, those who actually implement security products to protect the data, right? And then the third thing that you also want to discuss in this regard is the procedures, right? And what's happening with your procedures, these are the plans and the policies that we were discussing or that we literally mentioned superficially when we were looking at the different learning units. So the plans, the policies established, obviously by an organization to ensure that people correctly protect or correctly use products as far as your specific setups there are concerned. So that's the security triad that you obviously need to familiarize yourself with. But obviously, in addition to that, you can also even discuss two other factors that are literally strong contenders, which is authentication and non-repudiation, right? And if you want to look at it from a different point of view, I think maybe just to make it just for you to understand exactly what's happening in this regard, we'll go back to the AAA that we've discussed before. So remember, if you discuss AAA, what you're distinctively looking at is authentication. And then remember, with authentication, you're actually looking at access. And naturally, you're discussing usernames and passwords, electronic credentials that enable you to gain access to a specific environment as far as your configurations would go. But remember, usernames and passwords, if you want to look at it specifically, are now, if you want to look at it in a different perspective, your usernames and passwords are literally old style, and they're now considered insufficient. So there are now additional methods that need to be incorporated, which would include such content as a two-factor authentication, right? So normally you would discover, so here we can look at additional, in addition, so here we can just mention in addition, in addition to your usernames and passwords, you can discuss two-factor authentication. So two-factor two-factor authentication. Oh, come on. There you go. So two-factor authentication, and normally you can this can be either token or a smartphone app. So you'll normally find that most of these banking institutions now, you call in, you've got a problem with the debit order, you've got a problem with your account, for argument's sake. They'll ask if you've got, they'll ask you for your, obviously your name, ID number, and so on. And then they'll still mention that if you've got your banking app, I'm going to send I'll need you to authenticate as far as the actual banking app platform there is concerned. So this is part and parcel of something you have. So remember, when you're discussing tokens or when you're discussing the whole concept of the smartphone app, this is a typical example of something that you have, all right? And then the second thing that you also want to discuss is biometrics, right? And we've mentioned this before, unique human beings' physical features that obviously enable you to gain access to a specific environment as far as your generic setup there is concerned. So this is something that you are, all right? So with the two-factor authentication, with a smartphone app, with a token, it's something that you have. And then with biometrics, you're looking at something that you are. And then with the password is something that you know. So it's always important for you to take a cognizance of that distinctive fact. So if you were to look at it from a different perspective, password, right, or username and password would be something you know, right? And then with, for instance, a token or a smartphone app. So this is token. Let's get that right. This is something you have. And then obviously with biometrics, this is something you are. Oh, come on. Yeah, something you are. So I think it's important to take a cognizance of that distinctive fact. And then the A that you're looking at there is authorization, right? And remember, with authorization, this deals with permissions. With authorizations, this deals with permissions as far as your specific setup there is concerned. All right. So ultimately, you've got permissions, right? So what a specific account or user can do as far as your specific environment there is concerned. So the other thing as well that you've got incorporated is accounting, right? And some literatures might want to mention auditing. So you've got accounting. So this normally deals with some kind of audit trail, all right? So audit trail in terms of what a specific user did, audit trail, or so it's an audit trail or some kind of distinctive report associated with your specific configuration that is there. All right, so that's the particular setup that you've got incorporated. So another term that is associated with this account, because remember with accounting, it's you having there's an audit or there's a record of what someone has done on the system or what they've accessed, what data they've altered. The list will go on and on. Another term that you want to look, if you want to look at it from a different point of view that is associated with this accounting, would be non-repudiation. So here we've got non-repudiation. So this now is something that it just ensures that users cannot then deny having carried out a particular action on a machine, for instance, or on the network. And obviously, how can someone not deny? Because you've got a record of what they've done on the system. You've got a distinctive audit trail. So when you look at the whole concept of what is happening with the addition of the authentication we were talking about earlier on. So if you go back to what we were talking about earlier on in terms of, in addition to the CIA, authentication on its own is one of the configurations that are there. And then the second thing that you want to distinctively discuss there is non-repudiation. But again, like I said before, non-repudiation is ultimately one and the same with accounting. That looks at an actual audit trail that is there. So non-repudiation is all about just ensuring that someone cannot say that, okay, it wasn't them that did A, B, C, because there's always going to be a record of configuration that is incorporated in that regard. So that's the generics that you've got incorporated in that regard as far as your security configurations would go. Now, it's also important to understand certain terms. All right. Again, like we were mentioning earlier on, it's imperative for you to understand what's happening with certain terms such as an asset, a threat agent, vulnerability and exploit, and obviously risks associated in that regard. So, if you want to look at it from a different perspective, if you want to look at let's list the term asset here, right? In generic terms, an asset can be a car radio, right? If you want to look at it from a different point of view, right? Let's look at that as an example. But when it's discussing information security, an asset is an employee database, so a collection of data somewhere along the line, right? That's what a distinctive asset is all about. So if we use let's look at it from a different point of view here. Let's use the car stereo, the car radio as an example, as an everyday setup. So our asset in this regard is going to be a car radio, right? So with this car radio, if we discuss a threat, right? A threat, as far as this particular car radio is concerned, would obviously be it being stolen, all right? So threat would be stolen from the car. That's a typical example of a threat. What would be a threat agent? A threat agent here is the thief, right? What is a vulnerability in terms of vulnerability? This could be typically, let's say, a hole in the fence. Hole in fence. That's a vulnerability, right? And then if you want to look at it from a different point of view, what is a typical example of an exploit? When we're looking at the car radio scenario, this is someone climbing through the hole, right? So climb through hole in fence, right? And then what is the actual risk associated in this environment? This we can transfer to the insurance company, because we've anticipated that possibly my car radio can be stolen, right? So I'm going to insure it as a typical example. So transfer to insurance company, right? Good to go. So asset, car radio, right? And then the threat is actually it being stolen from the car. The threat agent is a thief. Vulnerabilities as us not obviously having a secure perimeter. We've got a hole in the fence, and then the exploit is someone climbing through that or through the fence, and then the risk is transferring it to the insurance company. Let's look at it from information security point of view now. All right, so from the information security point of view. So here, let's put this as information security. So we'll still have the asset. Right? What's a typical example of an asset when we're discussing information security? We talked about an employee database. So employee database, that's the actual asset or the data that we've got incorporated. And if you go back to discussing the threat, right? What's happening with the threat? This data being stolen. So threat is a steal data. And then when we're looking at what the threat agent would be, right? If you're looking at what is happening as far as the actual threat agent, this could be an actual attacker, right? Or your hackers. You can also discuss a virus or malware. You can also even discuss a natural issue, which could be a flood, right? That's a typical example of what the threat agent would be as far as information security would go. And then if you're going to be discussing the actual vulnerability, that hole in the fence, this time our vulnerability is obviously going to be a software defect, right? That's our vulnerability, software defect there. So someone can take advantage of a software defect that is incorporated as far as your specific setup there is concerned. So here it's software a defect, right? So that's our vulnerability. What's the exploit? The exploit here is distinctively obviously sending the virus to unprotected email server. That's the exploit. So this is, remember, we mentioned about exploit in the previous example is someone climbing through the fence. So in this particular instance, our exploit will be sending virus or malware to unprotected server. Server. All right, so here specifically we're discussing an email server, right? And then at the end of the day, what is the actual risk in this particular regard? What we're actually looking at is we need to educate the users. Right, so ensure that the users are educated in this particular regard in terms of some of the issues that can take place as far as your specific setup there is concerned. Right, so those are the typical examples of obviously some of the terminologies that you need to familiarize yourself with, and obviously how they work within your specific environment as far as your network configurations there would go. All right, so first of all, like we were mentioning earlier on, if you're looking at it from a generic sense, you've got the car radio set up, but obviously if you're looking at it from an information security point of view now, you've got the database as a typical environment of issue there. So you've got that particular database, and then you've got the data being stolen as a threat. What are you looking at? A hacker, someone who's attacking your environment there. It actually can be malware or environmental threats associated with your particular setup there. And then the actual vulnerability is a software defect. And what's the exploit? Obviously ensuring that you're sending a virus or someone sends a virus to an unprotected email server. And then obviously the risk is just to ensure that your users are ultimately educated in that regard, just to avoid any discrepancies that literally can arise in that aspect. So if you're looking at it obviously from a different perspective as well, you've got other terms that you obviously will need to familiarize yourself with: generic security, privacy, trust, big data, and data aggregation as some of the concepts or content that is naturally relevant when you're discussing the whole concept of arguably information security at large. But it's also important for you to understand what's happening with your generic information security or cyber security domains when you're looking at it from a larger perspective. And literally what you're discussing is generically information security, like we mentioned before, obviously concerned with the protection of data, so confidentiality, integrity, and your availability falls within this particular category. Obviously, in all areas of the information and not just existing within the cyberspace. And then you've got application security. So let's see if we can mention this cyber security at large. So let's put it this way. So here we can say cyber security at large. What you've got there is information security. Right, and like we mentioned before, this is what is normally associated with that confidentiality, integrity, and availability that we mentioned a couple of moments ago. And then when you're looking at the second one, you're discussing application security. Application security, and obviously this is obviously concerned with the introduction of controls and measures, obviously to an organization's applications, whether this includes the software, hardware, or information at large. So these are just controls put in place. So those policies that we were mentioning earlier on that deal with circumventing any unauthorized access and obviously jeopardizing content at large. Then you can discuss network security. And obviously, when you're discussing network security now, this is just ensuring protection of the organization's networks. So ensuring that we don't have any unauthorized access. This is when you incorporate things like intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems as well, to just ensure that your environments are ultimately secure. And this can obviously include your NOSes or your network operating systems and the security features incorporated in that regard, and incorporate virtualization as well, which would obviously act as another layer of protection as far as your associated systems would go. And then a network as a lone entity is all well and good, but then obviously at the same time, that also then means you obviously need to also discuss internet security, right? And this is now looking at availability of internet-based services. Now, not just the connection to the internet, but internet-based services associated with your. Remember, there's distinctive differences between an extranet and an intranet, right? Those are some of the concepts or terms that you also need to familiarize yourself with. I think it's part and parcel of research. This also works within the whole confines of internet-based services as far as your particular organization would go. So intranets, extranets, as typical examples, it's just a protection of individuals that are obviously also working or accessing organization resources, organization infrastructure from home, for instance, or from remote localities or within a remote environment. So it's important to have configurations they put in place. And obviously the fifth thing that you also want to also discuss rather is your CII, and this is short for your critical information infrastructure. All right, so this is just looking at protecting your infrastructure from threats. I think this becomes more of a national issue now, that you're now looking at protection of your national ICT infrastructure configurations from inadvertent threats or deliberate threats, whichever way you want to look at it, as far as your specific setup would go. So that would create what they call your security domains, right? So information security domains. So when you're looking at cybersecurity at large, this literally deals with information security domains. So what we've just listed is a typical example of information security domains. All right, as far as your specific setup would go. And you obviously, if you want to look at the actual relationship associated with these distinctive domains, you'll have something along these lines. So that's a typical example of how these particular configurations are naturally interrelated. Remember, earlier on, we were just discussing the whole concept of information security, application security there, obviously your network and internet security. So it falls within the whole concept of you've got cyber crime, cyber safety, cyber security, and then your critical information infrastructure that we were mentioning earlier on now works within those confines. So this is the actual relationship that you've got as far as your distinctive information security domains there is concerned. So that's the typical example of what's happening in that regard. I think from your own perspectives as well, look at what generic security, especially when you're looking at from the prescribed textbook, a setup that is there. So this is part and parcel of your research. Look at security. Let's label this accordingly. So security at large. So basic definitions that you've got incorporated there: privacy. How are these interrelated? You can also discuss trust. That's supposed to be 4. Big data and data aggregation. Right, so this is part and parcel of content that is obviously relevant as well. And then I think also look at the other examples of sources of data, right? So examples of, I think we listed a few of them. What are the other examples? So here we can just say other sources of data. Right. So also look at that as well in terms of your particular setup. So just look at, so we can make this 6, right? Let's write this accordingly. So other sources of data in that regard. But otherwise, I think that it literally looks at our introductory session, just understanding exactly what's happening in that regard, and obviously what's happening. So this is part and parcel of cybersecurity issues or problems, right? So the first part of it is just the generic introduction. Obviously, what we then want to also, look at is the big issues associated with cybersecurity. So obviously crime, different types of crime that are there, understanding exactly what's happening with Intellectual Property Act, delving into cybersecurity, cyber harassment, and cyberbullying, for instance, stalking, trolling, cyber warfare. These are all terms as well that we need to familiarize ourselves with, understand exactly what it means, not just from a personal point of view, but obviously from an organizational perspective, as far as our generic infrastructures or configuration setups there are concerned. All right. So let's see here if we can quickly have, so here, if we've got any questions from the floor, questions, contributions, or concerns, feel free to type so long. I think give me a second or so to unmute your mics should you need to say something. But otherwise, while that is happening, feel free to type in the chat so long. Do you have any questions, contributions, and or concerns from anyone? Questions, contributions, concerns from anyone thus far? What's happening with these mics now? All right, just a couple more seconds. Right. Should you have anything to say, go ahead and unmute and state your case or use the chat, whichever way works for you, whatever you're comfortable with. Questions, contributions, concerns from anyone? All right. Looks like we are good. Okay, so that's all well and good. And actually, I'll upload this, I think, within the next 15 minutes or so on the channel, the YouTube channel, and also send through the notes that we just created during the course of the session. But otherwise, if we don't have any questions, we're all good. Let's call it a day. We'll convene again, I think, in tomorrow's network architecture session. No. I think we did tomorrow. We could. I don't see you tomorrow. No, it's on Wednesday at 3. We'll have our first network architecture session in that regard. But otherwise, stay safe, keep smiling. We'll see you in the next one. Cheers.